All right, so really quickly, Arushi introduced you guys to Create React app, right? Okay, so what I'm gonna do is walk you through that. I feel that'd be the best way to introduce React. So I basically, all I did was run Create React app, and this is what I have, right, in my VS Code environment. So I'm gonna be explaining what all of these are, and then I'll be explaining kind of like how everything fits together. So I'll try to answer that part of the question. So we have public, source, node modules. I'm not going to open that. Getting more package.json. We have all these things. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff, especially if you're just starting out, right? You're used to just like index.html, style.css, 3 files max. Now you have a lot. So let me talk you through how this works, right? Let's start with app.js. One second. Let me just open a chat real quick. Okay, yeah. So you have app.js. And so actually, let me really quickly just start this up. App.js is where everything is, right? Everything that you want to be displayed is in app.js. I know Arushi talked to you about JSX, but just to reinforce the concept, JSX is basically just HTML with some wonky formatting. So what that means is you have class, right? Just like normal, except here you have class name. And I'll explain why those are that way in a second, but basically all I need to worry about in JSX is just knowing that it's HTML, but a little bit different. Not hugely different, and acts in the exact same way. So you can see that it hasn't started yet, but when it starts up, all this stuff will show up exactly like it would have if you put it in an HTML document. You're asking where's the CSS? Because we assign classes, so we have to use some CSS, right? Give me a sec. Yeah, while it's starting up, we can see here that we import CSS. So we already see that React's a bit different than regular HTML because we don't have like a head, a body. We don't have the typical HTML structure. It's a lot more Python, you could put it. I feel like the best way to refer to React would be, it's like JavaScript if you add a bit of Python to it. So instead of having head, body, link, all that stuff, we import everything. So our CSS is just like normal. You can see this is just normal CSS. A bit fancy here. Nothing different than normal CSS though. And yeah, so it's kind of like adding a link tag at the top of your HTML, but instead it's just importing it straight up. So pretty straightforward there so far. And actually taking a step back to talk about a JavaScript and Python comment, what React is basically a JavaScript framework. And what that means is it's built on top of JavaScript. So for example, if you worked with NumPy or Pandas or like a Python library, for example, Django, Flask, anything of that sort, that's a Python library, right? Same thing with React. React is basically just a framework for JavaScript where you use JavaScript, except you've added a bit more power to it. So you can see here, you have functions in JavaScript, right? This is just a regular function, except by using React, you can return HTML. And that's kind of the power of JavaScript. It's just JavaScript, but with a lot of extra features that make it way easier to build web apps. So let me going back to the structure of this. How React works is components is the best way to put it. Components are exactly what they sound like, components. You can think of a React app as Lego building blocks. Okay, you have your base. You could say you're like 20 by 20 green flat square if you guys have ever played with Legos in the past. And then your components could be just Lego blocks and you're trying to build a house. So if your foundation, which could be your one component, you could have the windows, could be another component, the roof shillings could be another component, and you're just kind of putting all the components together to build this one web app, your house. And it's kind of literal in that way. Well, not literal, but very analogous to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in that way. I remember during our info session and during the lessons in general, we talked about how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript were kind of a house. I guess could one of you guys go through that analogy for me really quickly?
Sure, yeah.
Right, go for it.
Oh wait, I thought you were gonna explain it. My bad. I don't remember.
Does anyone remember the house analogy we used for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript?
I could give it a shot.
Go for it.
So HTML, it's like the structure and like all the wood beams and all that. And then CSS was kind of just like your door and like your paintings, I guess. And then JavaScript was your electricity and the functionality of it.
Yeah, that's perfect. Nice job. And kind of linking that to React, that's exactly what React is. React combines HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build a house, but in a different way. Instead of putting up the foundation and then putting up the furniture and then putting up the electricity, you kind of do it all at once. So instead of worrying about electricity, you're like, you build like a thermostat and electricity just comes with it. So you can start taking a lot of things for granted with React, and that's kind of the power of React. So going into, I know I've been talking a lot about how React is so awesome and so different. So let me actually get into React. So how React is structured is components, and components are analogous to functions. So you can have function app, or you can make an arrow function. So I personally prefer it this way, const app equals this. And basically what you want your React function to return is HTML or JSX in this case. Very similar, but a couple of inconsistencies here, there, not super important. You can Google those. But basically you just want to return HTML. And at the end, you just want to export default your component. So in this case, our component is app. So we export default it. Not quite sure about export default. It's just kind of the syntax that React uses. And actually at the top of every React file, I don't know why they omitted it here, but you want to import React from React. So this is going back to how React is kind of like NumPy or Pandas for Python. You kind of import it in and you have the power of it. I used logo here. Let me just take that out. Not super important. Okay, so this is the bulk of your React app. This is what the only thing you really need to care about is app.js and any components you use in there. So let's say I define a window class that just says hello world. I can put in window here, and it's kind of like building blocks. I'm using my app.js component to build everything. Does this make sense so far? Okay, so now I'll go into how exactly that works. We could just take app.js for granted and just be like, nice, I can just start writing HTML, you know, p hello world. That did not go as planned, but close enough. So to understand the power of React though, we gotta step back a bit. Sure, we have all these, sure we can just write HTML. We've run HTML for the last 5-6 weeks, but why is React different than just HTML? Well, here's how. And it's kind of in all these things here to the side. Let's start with package.json. And also, just as a disclaimer, all these things are important not just as front engineers, but as software engineers in general, because these are just very general software engineering concepts and files types that show up in pretty much any project you do in the real world. So actually, let me cover all of these. Readme.md, you know, I'm sure you guys can probably extrapolate the meaning of Readme through the title, but you basically want to make it a very comprehensive document of your code, like a guide to your code. You can see here that the Readme contains the scripts you can run, and it's kind of what you want to do too. If your code is meant to be used by someone else, you want to give them as much detail as possible. Next, let's go into package.json. Here, package.json contains all the actual data of your app. You can see the names here. If I'm building a website for an organization, I can change the name to organization website or anything at all. Version is here. That's up to you. If it's good practice to increment the version each time you update it. You don't need to. Private, I'm not quite sure what this does, to be honest. And now we get to the important part, dependencies. So you can see here that dependencies are obviously React, React DOM, React scripts. Now every piece of code, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, even if you don't use React or use something else, has a package.json or something similar. In regular JavaScript, you don't have any dependencies, so package.json is just empty here, and you just can't see it. But every app will have a package.json. And the difference with the React one is that by default, it comes with React, because React isn't different from JavaScript. We're building on top of JavaScript. So that's a dependency for our app to run. Next, we go to scripts, and all this stuff is just kind of other information about the app. You can kind of figure out what it means, like development, you want it to support these versions, ESLint configs. That's just for some writing nice code. Scripts, those are what you can run in the terminal. So to start an app, you run npm start, and so that it tells it to make this the actual command that runs. So it's just a lot of information about your app. If you want a good overview of the app, you just need to look at the readme.md and the package.json to figure out how the app works. You can get a lot of data from there. And then you should typically have a package lock.json. Let me actually go over here. So you typically have a package lock.json. And what that does is it takes all the dependencies in package lock in package.json and tells the app what version to use. Because let's say you're using a dependency like React or something, and React has an update that breaks your app completely for some reason. You don't want your app to break, right? So whenever a computer actually tries to run your app, it looks at package lock.json, which shows the last working version of all the dependencies that went through. Now I've been saying dependencies a lot, but what are dependencies? Well, I can actually show you. Just open up this folder, and these are the dependencies. It's a lot. Never actually look into known modules. It's a lot of dependencies. And this is all just for a basic React app. These are all code, like Babel is a bunch of code, CSS tool is a bunch of code, Jest is a bunch of code. These are all files. It's not like React just magically works. It's because all of these are JavaScript that tells your app.js to be able to work like that. So that's the science behind React. You would never need to worry about this. It's a lot. You can just take known modules for granted. Okay. And then let's go into the rest. I guess we can quickly cover get ignore. Does anyone want to say what get ignore is? Does anyone know? All right. So I see a couple of confused faces. So y'all have used Git before, right? I'm assuming at least some of you have used Git or heard of Git. So it's a version control system. And get ignore is what your system should ignore when you push your files to Git. So when I push my files to GitHub, I don't want it to look at node modules because it's like, this is like 99% of my app size. And I don't want that to be exported everywhere because that'll take a huge amount of time and it'll be super clunky, right? It's super easy to like not ship node modules. So I put node modules in get ignore to make sure that I don't ship it everywhere. Because you don't want it to be shipped to your production build, right? Awesome. So that's kind of get ignored, just at a super high level. Now we'll go to public and source. So obviously you guys know index.html. And what you need for a React app is div ID root. I know Arushi already walked you through all these, so I'll just give these really fast. And that connects to index.js, document element by ID root, and all that stuff, right? And we render app. As a quick note, in case you haven't seen it before, React.strict mode, just make sure all the code inside of it, so in this case app, uses the latest features or doesn't use deprecated features. Not something you need to worry about, just good practice to have. If you use create React app, which you always should for pretty much almost any application, it'll come shipped with it. But at the end of the day, if you use create React app, all you'll need to worry about is app.js and everything else inside a source that you create. I know that was kind of a tour of React. Are there any questions? A lot of this stuff isn't super significant day to day, but super helpful when you're trying to debug things and things aren't working. I need to understand how React works. So yeah, any questions?
What's the difference between app and index?
So index could be app could be index. The only difference is the only reason we use index is so that we can wrap React.strict mode over all of our code. So we want to make sure if we want to be good programmers, that all of our code is using stuff that isn't deprecated, right? Stuff that's still meant to be used, stuff that isn't 10 years old. And React.strict mode just make sure it does that. And we want to wrap our entire code base in that. You don't just want like half our code to be running under strictest standards and half our code to just not care. So that's why we kind of have another this over all of our code. But otherwise, we could just instead put all of our code in here and then call this app.js. It's fine too, but just in general, this is how you do it. Just to make it easier, because you don't have to touch index.js in this case. You can just trust that it works. That's kind of the beauty of decoupling it from each other and having this extra layer. This way you can only focus, this way you only need to focus on the code.
Okay, got it.
Awesome. Any more questions?
So is React just object oriented, like to the max?
Yeah, that's one way you could put it. All right, or if there are no other questions, I will keep going on. So I guess I wrote some of this stuff here. And why React? So I did touch upon this a bit, but just to kind of hammer into you guys' heads, you combine HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's a huge time saver. Development speed, if you can reuse things. If you're going back to the house analogy, if you had to, every time you constructed a window, if you had to look at the blueprint for a window and get the materials for a window and then like figure out how to build a window from scratch, like hugely inefficient. It'd be much easier to just have a window, just copy and paste everywhere. And that's what you're able to do with React. If you ever worked on a multi-page website, for example, just a regular website, each page has to be a different HTML page, HTML file. And let's say you have a nav bar, you need to copy your nav bar into each file. And every time you make an update to your nav bar, you have to update it every time. Which is in React, you can just import nav bar. And if you make a change to your nav bar, it'll be reflected everywhere. So it is a huge time saver in terms of that. Performance. If you have a big app, it makes your app so much faster, like 10 times faster. It's beautiful. So that's also a big reason to use React. Testability, very easy to test compared to regular JavaScript. Dynamic rendering. I'm not going to get too much into those technical details, but that's kind of how you get the app performance. It only shows what it needs to, and that's why you're able to get such a speed up. And state. I know Arushi kind of talked about state with you guys a lot. It seems like there's a lot of confusion there. So just know that's a huge advantage of React versus JavaScript. And so also another popular request before I dive into more React was figure out where React is used. So if you're ever develop in React, there's actually a React Chrome extension that you use. So if you guys inspect element, I'll show you guys an example actually. Let's see, this is a React app. So let me inspect element. Yeah. And having these React developer tools means that I can, where is it? I haven't actually used a React developer tools in a long time, to be honest. Oh, here it is. You can see the React components and profiler. So instead of seeing all the raw code, I can see here that Notion has really bad variable naming, apparently. Let me find a different application that has better variable naming. Let's go to this one that I just made. And give it like a minute to load the React Devtools. Just really quickly, I'll just drop this link in the chat. I would recommend downloading these because it's also pretty fun to see what sites are in React and not in React. That might just be me. But basically, this will add this little React icon to your tab of Chrome extensions, and you can see that Airtable is in React. It's amazing. This is in React too, but it tells me that I'm using the development builder React. Damn, maybe because I am. It's wild. Chrome is not using React. That's wild. So yeah, it's kind of fun, but the real power is in actual developing. You can see the components here. I have app. Damn. Yeah, I mean, it's right. I only have app. So yeah, basically, I know this is kind of a boring example, but I'd recommend downloading the tools just because they are pretty helpful. All right, then just going back to the other stuff. This is an interesting article here from the Facebook team that created React about why React is useful. It kind of covers these points already covered already, but if you want to hear it from the builders of React, it is a pretty interesting read, pretty short, just like a page and a half. All right, so case of app.js. And now here's where I'll kind of cover actually using React. I talked a lot about the theory of React, why React, the underlyings of React, but I didn't actually talk about using React itself. So before I start coding, are there any quick questions, or are there any questions? All right, if there are none, let's get to coding. So let's cut all this random shit out. Start with a simple hello world. Hello world. That one's somewhat better. And let's just see it on the screen. That's half the fun of it. Yep. Beautiful. I love typos. Now, this is cool. We could have done this with HTML and CSS in like 2 lines. So why is this better? Well, I'm going to show you. Let's create another component. So app.js is our base, right? The foundation, the actual ground of our house. Let's create a component called window. Yeah, let's take the house analogy and make it way too literal. So now we have a JavaScript file. We want to make it a React file. So let's import React from React. You gotta do this at the top of every React file. Awesome. Why is this yellow? Oh yeah, because I never actually used React. And so there are a couple of components to each React function. One is importing React, obviously. Then you create the actual component. So const window, and just by convention, you name your component the same as its file. Easier for readability if you're looking around. We'll make it a function. And each function needs to return something, because that's how functions be. And then we export default window. Awesome. Now we have a component. Nothing in the component. So let's put something in the component, right? Let's say let's put window. It's a Pokemon. All right, and this is a React component. Pretty simple, right? And now we want to use our React component. So same way as you've done it in Python, let's import it and use it. So import window from /window. And something interesting in React, this is kind of a side note, when you import JavaScript files, you don't actually need to say .js. I'm sure that's for some reason, I don't know what reason it is, but you just say, I want from window. You don't need to specify that's a file, which is interesting. But yeah, the reason you're importing and giving it a name, by the way, this name could be anything. It could be whatever I want it to be. Is I'm taking the code from window and I'm basically making it a component. So I'm not treating it as a div and a p tag. I'm just like, this is a window, and this can be whatever I want it to. So let's say you want to use a component, right? How do you do that in HTML? Use as a tag. So you can do that the same way in React. And since it's just a tag, since it's just an object, it's just a self-closing tag, since you don't wrap it in anything. So now we put a window in there. We have our base. We just have the ground, a prairie, and a window. Amazing. And let's see if it worked. Yep, we have a window. So now let me talk you through the power of React and why it's different from JavaScript. So let's say I want a different color window, but like I'm very indecisive. Like every day I change my mind about what color window I want. So I want to be able to change it really easily. Excuse me. So we can pass those in as props to components. So let's say color equals red, right? So I want a red window today. That's traitorous to Berkeley. Let's just do blue. Go Bears. Save that. And then to do that for each component, it has to take in props as an input. So each component has to take in props or properties, or props for short. Now how we can use this is we can have another p tag here. And in JSX, if we want to use, and this is also the power of React, is we can use logic inside of our HTML. That's the super exciting part. Before in HTML, it was just you had to put text in and nothing else worked. But here you can use logic. So I can just put 2 + 2 and it would work. HTML can do math now. But I don't want to do math, right? I just want it to be a color. And so instead of hard coding red or blue or anything, I can say, whatever was passed in here from the parent, kind of like object-oriented programming, as Hector pointed out, it's a really great analogy. You can say props dot color. So when you pass in color here, it becomes a property. So you need to get color from property. This is the syntax for kind of accessing an object. So props is an object, and you're accessing the color parameter. So now we told it to be red, and now it's, oh no, we told it to be blue, and now it's blue. Perfect. So that's props. We can pass in as many as we want. We can just do size equals XL, and it can also be anything we want. Let's say we want the class to be the size. So class name, fix that, is equal to props.size. So you can put your logic in anywhere in your HTML, and that's the powerful part. So yeah, we haven't done anything with XL, but what we could do is in our CSS, we could have different classes for each size, and based on the size that we're inputting into the component, we can have that class be applied. And that's how that's also Power React. Let's say I want to put like 5 windows in my house, right? But for some reason I want it to be 5 different sizes. Instead of having 5 different window HTML files, or just 5 windows in 5 different places, I just have one window component and it just takes in a different prop. So object-oriented programming, you get to customize the children of your parent without having to copy it 5 times for each different possibility. That's kind of the part 2 of the power of React. Yes, before I go on, are there any other questions?
Wait, can you kind of explain what props is? You talk about how it's property.
Yeah, so props is just short for properties. So the best way to think about it would be, trying to think of a non-technical analogy. Yeah, so let's go back to the house analogy, right? So we have our house and we just want to put windows in. And we want one window to be red and big, and we want another one to be blue and small. Let's say that, for example, right? And so normally what we need to do is create 2 windows and then say that this one is big and this one is small. And this one is red and this one is blue. So it'd take at least 2 things, since they're 2 pretty different items, right? However, size and color are properties. So instead of copying them twice and telling the properties to be this way for one window and properties to be another way for another window, we can just say, hey, I'm going to tell you that each window has a size property, and you're going to be that size. Or you say, I want each window to have a property that is color, because I want each window to be a different color, or I want there to be multiple colors. So I'm going to put in the color here. You can also say style. Did Arushi teach you guys how to do inline style in React? Okay, I see confused faces. So style equals, and in React, it's kind of weird if you don't use a CSS file. Style has to be an object. So you have the double curly braces here because you want to make it a variable. And you have to put another set of curly braces in here to make the JavaScript object. It's kind of odd, but it fits in with the syntax of everything. So let's say color. Or is it color? Yeah. And then we can put in props.color here. So that way we can directly say, I want this style to be this color. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions? All right. If not, then let's go to the dreaded, actually, let me just create one more thing, right? So we have a window. What's another piece of household stuff? Anyone got any ideas? Door. Okay, that works. Also, Isabel, I see your comment. I'll get to it in just 1 second. So door.js. And what I like to do is just copy and paste. This isn't too complicated, so I'll just copy paste that. Just make this door. And I only want one door, so there's no real reason for it to take in anything, because if I wanted it to be customized, then I'd have more than one door, but I only want a single door. That's perfectly fine. Same process. We import door. from door, and then we use door. Damn, that was very complicated. But now look, we got a door and a blue window. All right, so Isabel, can you explain the arrow function real quick? Yes. So in the typical way you do functions in JavaScript is you could do a couple of ways, like function, app, that way, right? Very Java-esque, for example. Something great that JavaScript has is arrow functions. So it's a const function, or not function, because that's a reserved keyword, just const func is equal to, and you define a function. If you ever worked with Python and you've worked with lambdas, then an arrow function is similar to a lambda. And if you've taken 61A, I think you should have covered lambdas. If you haven't, you will. Basically, it's kind of like a temporary function. This won't really make much sense unless you've learned about lambdas in 61A, to be honest. It is kind of an odd concept to wrap your head around. But basically, you take in the inputs, let's say I1, I2, an arrow, and then you have your function in here. So return I1 plus I2. So it's just kind of a quick, easy way to write functions in just one line. So this is equal to function app with no inputs. And this is equal to function window with the input of props. It's kind of just a matter of preference. This way, arrow functions are more lightweight, so they are faster. So I would recommend arrow functions just in general. There are some tricky higher level things when deciding between the two, but typically arrow functions get the job done. All right, and then Emily had something too. It's great to hear, Isabel. All right. Yeah, so Emily, this is similar to object-oriented programming, and you can implement methods. I was actually getting there, so perfect segue. So let's say I want my door to be open or closed, right? Because that's what doors do. If it didn't open or close, well, then it'll only be able to do one of those, which is concerning. That isn't necessarily a prop, because the house, I don't know if the door's open or closed. That's up to whoever wants to mess with the door. I know if my window, I know that my window is going to be red. I know my window is going to be blue, but I don't know if my door is going to be open or closed. Because what if somebody comes in when I'm not there? You know, what if I don't live alone? Or if I do live alone, someone's trying to rob me, you know? You gotta prepare for everything. So the door being open or closed is its state. The best way to think about it is just literally its state is it's either opened or closed. It's not a property because it changes, and it can change very often. That's the best way to describe state. There are a couple of ways to implement state. We're going to start with class components. So here's where it might get a bit confusing. Let me know if it gets confusing. I'll pass the point of understanding. So we import React from React. And there are two ways we can write components. We can write them as functions or classes. And those are the two ways you can write components. So let's say we want this to be a class, right? So class door. And we want to make this a React class. So extends React.component. And we just curly braces. So if you ever worked with object-oriented programming, you know extends means that the parent class is React.component and the child class is door, which would be absolutely correct because React.component is the parent class for all components. And you're taking class door from that. So it's pretty literal so far. Now let's just recreate our old door, right? Let's just say we always want to be closed, something like that. So we could do return, do that, return div, why didn't autocomplete, div p, and door, right? Still a Pokemon. But you see there's a bunch of errors here. That's because in React components, you have to wrap your return with a render. So render is what's actually shown, which makes sense because in render you put your return statement, and that's where the HTML is. So you can see here that I just put inside render. Render doesn't take any inputs. I've never actually had to put inputs into render, so I don't think it's something you do very often. It's just kind of a syntactical wraparound around return, just kind of for the sake of pleasing the class gods, you could say. And now let's go into state. If you used Java before, actually, yeah, how many of you have used Java before? As a quick poll, if you go to participants, say yes if you've used Java before, no if you haven't. right, there are 5 answers. That means 2 or 3 of you are not paying attention. That's fine. I have more no's than yeses, so I'll just err on the side of using Java less as an example. Yeah. So in that case, let me try and explain classes a bit better then. So each class you can think of as an object. So in this case, it's a door. And when we're constructing the door, we want to have some initial properties. Let's say color brown, size 200 inches. So for that, we have a constructor. Let me write it down. Constructor. And that's a function, essentially. And don't ask me why. I don't know. Well, I mean, I do know, but it's oddly complicated. We take in props for constructor. And the one thing we want to make sure we absolutely must do is super props. And so there's a lot of background around why we do this, but that would take an entire lecture in itself, explaining just class principles. So now let me just talk about why we have a constructor here, right? So we can still press props into door. Like let's say I have 2 doors for some reason. One is brown and one is blue. Then I could pass in props here. That's perfectly fine. But each door has to have a state that could be changed very easily, right? So let's define state. So this dot state is equal to a JavaScript object. So this is the syntax of React when it comes to state. State is just an object that becomes a JavaScript object that updates itself continuously. And you have to remember that's this dot state and not just state. And that's also kind of going back to what React is. This dot state is extremely arbitrary. Like developers of React could have very simply just said, you know, let's just make it this dot not state. It's just a syntactical thing that wraps around JavaScript that allows you to call certain variables and lets the program know exactly what it is. If I didn't import React from React, then JavaScript would be like, what are you doing? I've never seen these things before. But because React tells JavaScript that, hey, state is this, then we're fine. So this is a JavaScript object, right? So we want the state to be, what do you call a door if it's open or closed? It just exists. I don't know. It's not a state. That would be redundant. I just call it X. You know, I don't have the brain cells to think of a name. And we want X is the state of the door. This one be closed at first. You know, home sweet home. X is closed. So now if we just leave it this, or actually, yeah, we want to know if the door is open or closed. Let's create another p tag, and you know, curly braces because we're using a variable that can be changed. And we're gonna get this dot state dot x. So what is this dot state dot x? Someone tell me. Oh, a jar is a good one.
Closed.
Yeah, closed. So what will we put here? Closed. Very simple. But you know, it might change. So, or actually, let's say a better example to get before that. Let's say I just get my door default, it's open. Okay, I have no idea how doors have defaults, but let's just say that they are. And default is open. If I want to change that, right? As soon as I get the door, I want to close it. So what we can do is we can add a component did mount function. So now this is where it's going to get somewhat complicated. Component did mount is what it does is pretty much in the name. So component, you know, this is our component, doors are component. Did mount is when it loads. So mounting is what React calls rendering on the screen. So when this actually loads up on my screen and I see it, that means that's mounted. When I switch to another page, then it unmounts. Does that make sense? Okay, it's an interesting concept to wrap your head around, but it comes with practice. So this function will run as soon as the page loads. So I want to change the state, right? So it's set state, this dot set state. So set state is the function, the built-in React function for changing state. So this dot set state. And what we do into this dot set state is we pass in a new state. So before it was a jar open, I want it to be a jar closed. Closed. Now, can someone tell me what'll pop up on the screen after when I switch to our web app? What'll show up on the screen? I want to have a guess. I mean, there's only two possible answers. Wait, Isabel, what do you mean by it? Oh, it'll close. Yeah, exactly. It'll show closed. So when our React app was loading, so this doesn't have a huge load time because it's just 4 words, 5 words. But let's say you had a huge website with like a bunch of pictures and it had like a load time of 10 seconds. During those first 10 seconds, the door would be open. And as soon as everything starts showing up on screen and the door shows up, it becomes closed. So this is the equivalent of saying like, as soon as I get the door, I'll close it. But now like we want to be able to open and close the door, right? So we had to create a function for that. And let's say every time I click on it, we want it to change since we can't actually open and close the door over code. So on click, right? Because that's a JavaScript function. We run a function. And since a function isn't in HTML, we have to put curly braces around it. So let's just define a function. Let's call it a jarred. And do that. So JavaScript class components have interesting syntax. You don't need to actually say it's a function. It just knows it is. It kind of goes back to the power of React. You just can assume all these wonderful things and they're right because React is like, sure, homie, we got you. So now we want to change the state, right? But we want to change it to the opposite of what it is. We can't just say not a jar because a jar isn't a Boolean true or false. So let's check. If this.state a jar is equal to open, we don't want to close it, right? So then we can take a Q here. It's the exact same thing. We want to close it. Else, want to open it. So exact same thing here. A jar open. So basically all this does is just switch what the door is. Excuse me. So now in onClick, we want to call a function, right? We can't just say a jarred because JavaScript want to know what this was. React want to know what this is. So we basically, this is kind of where arrow functions come into play. We define a new function in here that just returns a jarred. This.ajarred. I think I could run it. Actually, let me just double check. It's been kind of rusty. Yeah, no, this doesn't work. Let me do this. Okay, this should work. Yeah. So we just use a function here that takes no inputs and then just calls this.ajarred. So each time the state is changed, and this is reflected here. So you can see each time a jarred is called, it changes. So that's the state. Let's say I was being all fancy and I made an actual door looking thing for it. And then like you could display like this house is open, something really fancy, like an actual web page and not just a single word. This would be super cool. So yeah, that's the basics of state. Properties are something that the object has that will not change for a project. Like if that window is red, it will stay red. Versus state is something that can change with the object. Like the door can definitely open and close. If I put in a property that it's blue, doors can keep on being blue. But I mean, I could change it, but that's besides the point. Then it would become state because I could change it. But let's say I just for some reason just really love blue. Of course I love blue. We're going to Cal. But yeah, state is for some things that would change within that object. So I know this was a lot to cover so far. Any questions so far? Let's make sure I'm covering everything I meant to. Yeah.
Wait, do you have to have the constructor props in it? Like inside the function or inside the class?
If you don't actually do anything with a constructor, if you don't have state, let's say you just have a regular door component, you don't need to have a constructor. But if you work with state, you have to have a constructor. So you could just do, if you don't use state here, if you just had it be open all the time, then you don't need any of this. But yeah, since you have a state, you need a constructor.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. You can't say this dot state is equal here. React will tell you to do something I probably shouldn't say. But basically, yeah, you have to declare state here in the constructor. Awesome. Any other questions? All right, in that case, I will keep on going. So I know Arushi did the tic-tac-toe game, which can be very interesting in a bad way if you're new to React. So I'm just going to keep on going with, there are a couple of things I could do. Actually, I'm going to make a poll, but I don't know how to make polls. So just go to participants and say yes or no. Yes, if you want me to keep on constructing something small from scratch, or no, if you want me to walk through a React app that I've already written and show these principles in action. Okay, so 2/3 no. That means I'll go and show something I've already built. For the people who said yes, don't worry, I will try to focus on the basics. All right, give me a minute to pull something up. Oh, I have a good one. This code is not terribly great, but I also did not write it. Or actually, there are a couple possibilities I could show. No, I'll show the web dev website. Yeah, relevant example. Give me a second to screen share. Yes, so this is the website for web development at Berkeley. Let me start it up really quickly. And this code is I'd say pretty decent overall. The quality at certain places can be kind of sus, but no, we did our best at 3 a.m. That is probably the average time I worked on this at. So actually, this is a good idea to show where, this is a good place to show where the structure of React can differ. So we have app.js, right? And you see, we have all these other folders that weren't there to begin with. When you have a lot of different files, like let's say like 20 different pages, which is what the web development at Berkeley page has, or not 20, but I think 8, then you don't want to just have 8 different JavaScript files in a list here, because you'll lose track of what is meant for what. And especially if you have a bunch of components. So like one page can have 5 different components if it's a super complicated page. You don't want all your files just be in a list, because that does get confusing. So the typical architecture is you have pages. And let's say we have our about page. That's great, right? Actually, let me find yeah. So we have our about page here. And the components we use are, that we wrote ourselves, are site navbar and footer. So those are components, those aren't actual pages. So you put those in components. You can see we have our contact here, we have our footer here, we have our navbar here. And that's how you differentiate pages from components. Super useful. And you also don't want to put your images in one place, like all over the place, I mean, just because that does get unwieldy and bad for organization. So you have an image folder typically, you have a CSS folder, and this is just something I was working on. This doesn't show up in any other thing. This is just me screwing around. But yeah, so let's look at app.js to start off with. What you typically do in app.js for most multi-page applications, which web dev at Berkeley is, we have a couple pages here you can see, is your app.js is for navigation. So here, actually, let me talk about that really quickly. For navigation in React, there are a couple of choices. The easiest one for beginners is reach router. And this is just a React package, right? So it tells you how to install it. Run this in the command terminal. That, beautiful. That did not work for obvious reasons. And it tells you how to import it. You import router link from reach router and tells you how to navigate with it, right? you have router, and you have each page with its thing. Yeah, with its thing, with its path, with its URL. So we import the router, and we also have our landing about education page. We have all these pages, right? And all these are components in themselves, because everything you create in React is a component, even your app.js. And so we import these components, and we say, hey, router, when the path is slash, so it's the home page, go to landing. When slash about, go to about. And basically those are components that show up. Now, I know this is kind of out of the blue navigation, but it's super important to know about. Reach router and React router are the main ones in case you ever need to search them up, because most of your projects will need some routing of some kind. And this is also how you do routing by importing each page as a component. So that just further solidifies how React is just object-oriented programming. You have your application and you have your pages, and when your pages, you have more components. All right, so any questions on that? All right, before I go on, wait one sec. How do I do this? Let me share the code again. Yeah, so as you can see here in app.js, it's just no actual HTML, but it's pure JSX, where we actually use routing and all that stuff in there, right? And just to drive home dependencies, you can't really tell, but my no modules has way more than before because I had to download routing, right? Routing is a lot of work. And also, if you look in pack.json, I have reach router. So I know already that my code uses reach router. I also use node sass, jQuery, all these things. This is how you can tell what the code does. Just kind of connecting back to earlier. And here's a package doc.json. You don't need to be able to read this. It's just machine code telling you that, hey, for whatever dependency this is for, Babel, that's a package. I'm not going to explain it now. But basically, this version is the one that I'm using, and it works in my code. So use this version whenever I'm trying to download this application for somewhere else. So I guess going back to the actual code. So I imported about, right? And that only shows when we have a path of /about. So let's go to /about, what we offer, right? So let's look at the code. A lot of things to import here. A lot of things. When we want to use an image, we can't just say like image source equals the file path. We kind of have to do it a two-step way. Same way that we use a component, each image is a component, where we import the file as whatever we want. And then when we actually use the image, we have to use it as a variable, basically. So that doesn't really make sense because your image isn't going to change, but just a syntactical thing to remember when you use React. So you can see here, site navbar. I want my site navbar on every page. And normally in HTML, you'd have a different HTML file for every page, and you have to update site navbar every time on every page. But this way, I can just make one page to site navbar over here, and it reflects everywhere. So that's also a nice thing about React. Container, row, I know these things I didn't actually make them, and these aren't actual HTML tags. So I imported Bootstrap. Have any of you guys ever heard of Bootstrap? Okay, so I see a couple of nods. Just to explain, Bootstrap is just a library where you can get pre-built components. So instead of having to build rows and columns, it's like, yo, I can just import container, row, and columns as components from Bootstrap. And if you check pack.json, you can see Bootstrap as a dependency. It's like, yo, I want a container, I want a row, I want a column. And it'll build them for me without having to do all the CSS myself with Flexbox. So you can see here, XS equals 12. These are just props for each column and row that Bootstrap asked me to do. If you look at the Bootstrap website, it has great detailed documentation on what exactly each thing needs to take in. And personally, if you use a project, I would highly recommend React Bootstrap because it does save time, but also really drives home the core concepts of React and components. So yeah, I also recommend using it on the project just because it really helps you understand what React is all about. So yeah, and this just looks like standard HTML for the most part. Classes, all those things. Nothing super exciting here. It's on-click navigate. I think there was a weird thing here with the image where I didn't want to use an A tag, so I used navigate function, which I imported from Readme. I don't quite remember why. I think a tag wasn't working. But yeah, pretty boring as a page overall, to be honest. Let's go to something more interesting. Let's go to, yeah, you know what? Let's go to team. Let's go to something cool, right? So everything looks same here as before, except we have data. And if we go to data, and this is horrible architecture, right? Don't put your data in pages. I was just being lazy. We have what's basically we have a JavaScript object, a JSON object of all the information that we want to display, right? And this is also where the beauty of React comes in. Instead of every time you place a window, instead of saying it as a prop, like, hey, I want you to be red, I want you to be blue, because you normally don't build houses. Like, I doubt any of us will be building a house sometime in our life. We usually buy a house or leave it to someone else to build a house. So let's do that instead. Let's say we get a contractor to build a house. So instead of actually putting the window yourself and saying, when you get a blue window, you're like, hey, so you're building this house for me. It would be cool if you guys had a blue window and a red window. So you write it down and that's data, right? You're not actually saying it is a property, but you're not actually setting it. That might be kind of confusing. What I'm saying is this is just all your data that you want displayed, right? And it's way easier to write down your data in a separate file than change it in your app. Because here you can have your data for your entire website, your entire 10-page website, instead of having hard-coded data on each site. And when you need to update it, you need to find a specific page and update it there, versus just updating it all in data. This is kind of a good model in terms of how you structure your app. It is kind of not out of scope, it's just kind of tangential to scope. So if you're confused, let me know in the chat. Otherwise, let me show power of this. So team, right? Now, ignore all this. This is advanced React. But what I'm trying to get at here is, where is it? Not there. But yeah, I made a component called team level, right? If you go to team, you can see that we have 3 kind of levels for each role. And so these 3 components are very similar, right? And that's also kind of where you use React components. Like, these things are very similar. I do not want to write the code for these things 3 times. I'd rather just write 1 time, because they're basically the same thing, but with just different attributes, right? So that's where this comes in. I made a team level component, and it took in title and the data. And what I did for this, if you go to team level, is it becomes clear why data was useful. Or inverse team level. Here it is. I took in the data as a prop, and I mapped it. If you guys have taken 61A, you've encountered map. If not, it's basically a function that maps an array to each item in an array. It's kind of convoluted. You don't need to worry about it, but the main idea is I took each thing in the data application, so in the data I put in the names, and I returned an image with all that stuff, right? So that way, and all the other data for every other person. So that way I was able to turn 3 very similar looking things into one extremely generic thing that could take in anything. And that again is the power of React in a more real world setting than building a window that says window. Like, these 3 components are very similar, but with just slightly different wording and slightly different data to show. And so in React, I could just pass in educators, external leadership as props. I can pass in title as props. I can pass them who I wanted to show as props. And so instead of writing this code to only work for 1 person or 2 people, or having to write a different piece of code for each person, I can just make a very generic piece of code that takes in everything it needs to know as variables. So that is the power of React versus JavaScript. You can use variables, sure, but it's a lot more bulky. It's a lot weirder to actually use the variables in your HTML and have your variables end up being displayed. You have to use in functions like get element by ID, append child, and JavaScript doesn't have any state. So if you click something, I mean, sure, you can change what shows up, but it's 5-6 lines of code versus 1 line of code. So that's kind of real world power of React. And now that's it for this lecture. I have one more thing to show you, but it is not necessarily lecture related. Before we stop the recording, are there any questions about React or anything at all really with React? All right, going once, twice, twice. All right, I don't know what I fucking said. Okay, and
You frozen.